So welcome today to today's episode of Coffee with Chris. On the cybersecurity side, we have Marc Sanders on today, and he is interested in me because he reached out to me through my LinkedIn group and asked if he could put out a series of surveys for a doctoral thesis he's doing, surveying some experts in the cybersecurity arena, looking for some, how to, and I'll let him explain it as after I let him introduce himself, but how to kind of put together things that'll work from the expert standpoint. What are all the things that we need to cover in cybersecurity, kind of looking forward and at future protection? So, Marc, welcome to today's show. How are you doing today?
I'm doing real good, Christopher. Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate this opportunity.
Sure, and I'm glad to have you. This is kind of a new thing we started here with the cybersecurity stuff, and I'm hoping that we can shed some light, especially on areas that I'm passionate about, and the critical infrastructure and the Internet of Things. And I just think there's, as well as from our conversations, you feel the same, there's some incredible lack of understanding or direction in where we're heading with cybersecurity in the future when everything becomes an interconnected device. And everything that has a computer basically starts communicating and negotiating for power online is the first phase in it, but then all the rest of the things that kind of go along with that. So, Marc, welcome today. Tell us a little bit about your background and what you're trying to achieve here with your thesis work.
Well, as I guess I should start out by saying I've spent over 20 years working in law enforcement, and one of the areas that I've worked in is the cyber field, among others. But a few years ago, I started on a journey of obtaining my doctoral degree. And as part of the capstone of getting a doctoral degree, certainly you are expected to do relevant and interesting research through a doctoral dissertation. And one of the areas that was of great interest to me in working on my doctoral dissertation was that of protecting our national critical infrastructure from cyber terrorism. Became very interested in the field, and as part of that, you're expected to develop expertise, expert knowledge in the field. And so I set out on a journey of looking for all of the scholarly research, all the journal articles and books and things of that nature that discuss cybersecurity and cyber terrorism. And as part of this process, I decided to write my doctoral dissertation on the subject of attempting to prevent cyber terrorism to our national critical infrastructure. Now, while that seems fairly straightforward, there's a number of different areas and a number of different fields that I discovered were certainly germane and needed to be explored. What I decided to do was to basically try to do what is called a Delphi study. Delphi study was kind of a systematic procedure that was developed back during the Cold War by a group of scholars that worked for RAND. And what they did was they set about attempting to put together a group of experts that would explore how we could prevent being bombed by the Russians, which was a relevant importance, very significant importance back in those days. Well, fast forward many, many years to today, where we have a situation where we're trying to figure out how we can prevent our national critical infrastructure and our most important systems, both in the defense field and on the civil side, from being attacked by hackers that are basically bound in intent to attack us for criminal purposes, as well as potentially for terrorist purposes. What I'm trying to do in a nutshell is to develop a group of experts that work in the field and that have knowledge in the field, both in academia and on the practical side, that can provide us some answers about how we can prevent our national critical infrastructure from being attacked by terrorists or people that basically would want to do us harm.
Yeah. So are you looking at more design, like a systems engineering approach, or looking at policy and things that people can make a decision on in their company or their organization?
That's a great question because, as I said earlier, it is a broad field that needs to be attacked from a number of different perspectives. And one of the things that I'm looking at is how we can protect our systems that are basically built up of different components. What are those components that need to be protected? How can we better protect those components? That's one of the things that I'm asking the experts to weigh in on and give me background and information about. A second would be the management practices. We have folks that manage the different people that are involved in protecting our networks, protecting our systems, and they don't necessarily see things from the same perspective. They don't necessarily come from the same background. What are the things that we can do to get those folks? And these are things that are grounded in the literature that I reviewed that said, hey, really need to be addressed. They really need to be looked at. What are things that we can do to bring the people that work on a day-to-day basis on our national critical infrastructure and securing our systems together with the administrators that kind of provide the resources and the background to do that. The other thing that is very important is the policy perspective. From a policy perspective, what policies do we need to look at? What do we need to adopt? What do we need to enhance? Or what necessarily do we need to do away with from a policy perspective that addresses our national critical infrastructure? One thing that has certainly been something that's been struggled with in that background, in that arena, has been public-private partnerships. What are the partnerships between the government and our different private operators of national critical infrastructures? How can those be improved? How can they be enhanced? Finally, the decision-making systems, decision-making in terms of how we protect our national critical infrastructure and the systems that develop it, how can those be better enhanced? So these are all areas that I found that really need to be delved into and addressed by the experts.
So what are you running into? I mean, as far as when you start talking about these different areas with people, what are you getting enough collaboration yet to start putting together some theories?
Well, no, I'm still looking for experts that would be willing to participate in the study. Although I found a few, I'm still trying to get a broad enough group of folks together that might be able to help me with this. And what I am starting to see in terms of the answers that have come in so far, one of the things that is very interesting is, and I'm not so sure it's something that there's a silver bullet for, a magic cure. I think the underlying theme from both perspectives is that of trust. I think when you look at those public-private partnerships and you look at bringing the government actors and the private sector operators of the infrastructure together, that trust is something that is still developing and still needs to be developed. For background, for those that don't know, back many years ago, all the national credit, the water company, the power company, most of the critical infrastructure providers, it was owned and operated by government entities. And then somewhere along the way, mainly in the late 80s, the concept of privatization of these entities came along, and we realized that not only would the government would they be able to give up the expense of maintaining and operating these utilities, but there could be a profit that could be made from having those utilities privatized and then taxed. So now, in contrast, by some estimates, up to 90% of our national critical infrastructure is owned and operated by private entities. And that sounded good, but as the technology has progressed as well, we've come into a situation where those private industries have to be somewhat regulated. There has to be oversight. There has to be directives. And now we're at a junction where we have to decide how can we better look at those different ways of going about working with our national critical infrastructure operators to make sure that they're not vulnerable to attack, not only by criminals, but potentially by terrorists as well.
Mm-hmm. So in the whole trust and private-public partnerships, and I've worked a lot in this area too. So I've seen that a lot of, at least we'll say 5 years ago, the thought was the government's going to regulate this and it's all going to be fine. And then that has turned away from that to the government regulators said, let's follow a big business that is a groundbreaker and leads the way and do what they do. And we'll say that's going to be the standard. So I haven't seen that happen either. And then I think a lot of those would be kind of utility companies, or these ex-government utilities that you said used to be part of the government, now they're private entities or whatever. And they've said, well, let me have a big vendor that can make a product that I can just implement everywhere, and that way I don't have to do the work. I don't have to make any regulation. I don't have or determine what the standards are. I'm just going to follow somebody that has something that works. So all three of those kind of big parties have been at odds, and just kind of nothing's been done is what I've seen. What's your thoughts on that?
Well, I think that there has been some efforts to try to develop the public-private partnerships. It's something that our government has put some thought and some work into, but I think, as you said, it hasn't been solved. The problem is still there, and from a bigger perspective, I'm not sure that it's entirely something that we're just going to be able to regulate away. I think as long as we have that issue of our private entities not trusting the government, first of all, you got to look at it from the perspective of, if I ran a utility company, let's just say a water company, and there was somebody that was lurking on the perimeter of my company, and I thought that they were going to come in and poison the water, or they were going to try to engage in some type of sabotage, I would have no problem with calling the authorities and telling them, hey, I need you guys to come in and perhaps stop these people from entering, or if they have entered, get them out, do something to them. However, if I have someone attempting to attack my network and do some type of damage to it, if I call the government, or I call and I send up a red flag that I have these people trying to do some type of damage to my system, and I think there's the possibility that I may be able to stop these people on my own, you can see the difference there. Do I have the same responsibility to call the authorities and say, hey, these people are potentially attacking my system, my cyber systems, as I do to say, hey, these people are attempting to attack my physical systems? Mm-hmm. It's an important distinction, and one that is still developing in terms of what do we do to stop these things from happening.
What about organizations like the information sharing, the ISACs? What kind of a role do you see them playing? It sounds like you're kind of describing exactly what they're looking at doing, at least on the real-time collection and monitoring of what different people feel as threats in these different public-private partnerships.
Well, I think their role is very important, and I think that what they're trying to do is also very important. And I think it was also somewhat of a defensive measure to prevent things like the recently passed cybersecurity regulation, which basically mandates that businesses provide information to the government. So is that going, or having the ISACs, is that going to completely resolve or prevent the problem? No. Is it something that needs to be done in order to prevent the problem from getting worse? Yes, I think it's absolutely something to be done. And I think anytime that we can get our different businesses or operators, both public and private, because there are still several public entities that are engaged in utilities and maintaining the national critical infrastructure. Anytime we can get them talking and we can get them working together, that's a win. That's important. But they have to do it in a mutually respectful and productive manner, because if nobody is really sharing information with each other and all we're doing is looking at each other across the table and sharing information that's really not very useful, it's kind of a waste of time.
Yes. You just hit on something that having spent a good portion of probably 5 years doing several different standards groups and these government public-private partnerships attempts at talking, the mutually respectful manner that you said, what I saw in almost every one of these organizations is such a bureaucratic power play of one organization being basically the ultimate authority and trying to solicit information that they wanted from multiple entities coming in. We'll say smaller players, businesses, consultants, people just trying to find a way to make a business or make a way in this arena. But it was a very much a one-sided, one-directional conversation. Did you see the same thing?
Well, I think that's very important. I really don't have the same experience that you have and some of the other folks that I'm leaning on to help bring this to the table. But I think that really brings up one of the crux of the issues that needs to be explored and that I really want to delve into in my doctoral research. And that is, how do we bridge that divide? How do we bring the public-private partnerships together? I know I'm certainly not the first one to have looked at this, but I have been unable to find any research where somebody said, rather than me just sitting down and trying to solve the problem, why don't I go to Christopher Garag and 5 or 10 or 15 other people like him that have background and expertise in this field, and why don't I ask them, what can we do to promote that mutual respect? What can we do to get these two sides working together in a meaningful and productive way? Because I've yet to be able to find any research where anybody has necessarily done that in a way that has solved the problem. Is it possible that we can't establish that mutual respect, that mutual trust? I don't know, but I think that we would be remiss by not attempting to do so, and that's what I hope to do.
Yeah. So, and I know you're familiar with my work, but I sat in a lot of those type of meetings, and I realized that we weren't talking the same language. So I was from this background of EE and industrial controls for many years, and only later in my career got associated with what I call information security, InfoSec. I always kind of abbreviate it. And I wasn't talking the same language as the people who did InfoSec, but when I looked at the numbers, 95 to 99% of the people in all of cybersecurity and all these groups come from an InfoSec background. So it was an underrepresentation of a whole kind of, we'll say, side of a market that is probably as big or not even bigger on the industrial controls EE side, the electronic design, than on the computer science InfoSec side. And so I set out, and you've read some of my work over the last probably 4 or 5 years to try and define the gap and define what the difference is. And the biggest thing I came down to is, from my whole career in working with industrial controls, all the designers, all the manufacturers, all the implementers, we don't care about data. And data is transferred as commands. And if you transfer the same command 100 times a day over a communication because you're just turning on and off something mechanical, that information is not even valid in any to save. So there's no saving, there's no memory on most of these machines that do industrial controls and mechanical operations. But yet, information security, InfoSec side, 100%, I would say almost 100% of their effort is spent on information. So you have one whole half of cybersecurity that doesn't care about information, and another half that's all their whole cybersecurity approach is based on. And that divide and that gap seemed to be prime number one when I started evaluating how to bridge this and how to make these kind of groups come together. So what's your thoughts on that?
I think that's also very important, and that is such a prime example of what I'm talking about when I say that there is a divide between those who actually do the work on a day-to-day basis and those who administrate, those who manage the work, and those two worlds not necessarily being together. But another important part of that is we have this data flowing back and forth from these devices, our supervisor control acquisition systems, and in a lot of cases, it's not encrypted. That information is flowing back and forth, and people are able to basically pilfer that information, basically insert themselves within that information. That's one of the other big parts of it. So you can see how many different aspects we just identified. Number one, we have an information vulnerability in our systematic components. That's one of the areas that I really want the experts to weigh in at and look at. Number two, we have a management practices perspective there. Number three, how do we solve that problem? Do we implement a policy that says, hey, let's go ahead and make sure that the data is encrypted? It has to be. There's a standard that says that it has to be. You can see where I'm coming from. There's a number of different relevant and germane issues that really need to be focused on and really looked at.
Yeah, and you when you hit each one of them, the first one is I started trying to say, what is the divide? And then how does that divide affect what you're trying to do, say confidentiality? And for one, I mean, yes, you don't really care about data on industrial control systems. It's just very small commands, very lightweight. At the same time, you have designs around being lightweight that cause problems with the confidentiality methods, the encryption, because they take an unknown amount of time. So that gets into kind of the second divides, which is the people versus machine to machine, and the timing becomes an issue. And then some other divides, and this is just, you mentioned earlier, authentication, where in information security we authenticate a machine and a person together. But if you have thousands of machines running without people, you lose that whole piece of authenticating a person and a machine, and then the data, the communications is more based around how do we then trust that machine that is running without a person and could have had somebody else come up to it and do something to it. So that piece, and trust, I always say, is like the time of authentication. So if you authenticate a machine and then you walk away for 2 years, how do you know that 2 years later you still have it authenticated? So that piece of adding time to authentication is trust. But in the InfoSec side and IT world, that is done by people. So it's kind of removing the people aspect becomes the next big piece of how do these systems then, what divides are there?
Well, I think, from that perspective, how do we go about it? It comes down to the question of what do we do in order to remedy that problem? Yes, it's going to take more time. Can we improve that through using better technology? Perhaps. Can we do it today? Maybe. There's so many different aspects that we have to consider when we look at those two different kind of what you're referring to as divides, that I'm not sure that I really necessarily have 100% solution. And that's what I'm trying to do, is get together a group of people that can not only A, do what you've just done and bring up specific problems, but B, provide what are the specific and relevant solutions that can be processed and adapted in order to do that. So that's why what I'm trying to do is so critical here.
Yeah, and I believe it's critical too, and I applaud you for it, and I think that I hope that we have a lot of response to this and experts coming your way, and I definitely have helped with trying to circulate that. But I'd say the one problem that you're going to run into everywhere is people with this expertise are so busy right now that finding some time to pull them aside when they are one of the most pivotal pieces of their company is going to be difficult.
You're absolutely right, and that has been a challenge so far. People that are doing this, I'm kind of relying on them not only to come up with these answers, but to develop a consensus among them. So that's going to require more than one round of questionnaires.
Yeah.
And I'm hoping I can find enough people. I'm not anticipating this process taking longer than 15, 20 minutes at a time. Mm-hmm. I'm just kind of hoping people can give me that much time to take a look at this and help me out with this, and kind of provide their unique perspectives that we can take forward and compile, and kind of like the guys were doing back in the 50s when it was trying to protect us from being bombed by the Russians. Now it's kind of trying to protect us from being hacked and possibly harmed by the terrorists. So both of these are very important endeavors.
Yeah. Have you received much or looking at support in kind of the standards bodies group? Like kind of we talked about earlier, they're a lot of times big in the policy and wrapped in the government. Or are you looking for more of the small players that are in the companies, that are in the trenches, or kind of both? What's your thoughts there?
Both. I'm trying to get a broad perspective, not only from the people that do this on a daily basis, but also the people that are involved in the policymaking aspect of it. And I'm not looking for necessarily 1,000 people to provide their perspectives. I'm looking for a small group of experienced people that have the expertise in this field, probably about 24 folks that I can really go to and get their perspectives, and then go back to them and say, okay, this is what I discovered during the first round of questions, validate it, and then go forward from there.
Yeah. So what, on your first round of questions, give me some. I know I'm going to have you send me. I'm going to get on your list here too, but give me some examples so people can see what they expect.
Well, one of the things that I go back to is when I ask people what are the ways that we think that we can be attacked by terrorists in our systems. One of the biggest ones was certainly infiltrating our supervisor control and access systems. Our SCADA systems was one of the ways. People also said, from a unique perspective, you need to really kind of be broad when you look at what are potential attack points, because while I think of public utilities, water, electricity, our wastewater control systems, they also said, look, our banking and our networks that we have are all done through computer systems, and if those are attacked, they could do us irreparable harm. If our banking systems are attacked through folks that want to mess up how we trade securities and how we go about our national economic activity, that is also certainly a vulnerability. One of the things that really kind of surprised me when I looked at policy making was people also said we need to not only attack this method of how we come together in our public and private partnerships, but we also need to sit down and we really need to look at having the government agencies that are involved in that work with our public-private partnerships. In other words, maybe there needs to be some type of ombudsman or group that we can engage. That's their job. They control the public-private, or at least administrate the public-private partnership enhancements. One of the areas that I'm really interested in this whole thing is the decision-making processes that we engage in going ahead and developing policies for enhancing and developing our cybersecurity framework. One of the things in government, I'm sure you know this, people that are listening certainly know it, is that it's very disjointed. It's there's a lot of different. There's no single government entity that is involved in cybersecurity and is the be-all, end-all. We have so many different agencies across our government in both the civilian and the military world that are involved in protecting us from cybersecurity, and bringing those groups together and having them work together is something that we want to do, but how do we do it? And that's why I need this buy-in from the experts that can sit down and can look and say, these are the things that we need to bring to the table and we need to focus on. And I really haven't gotten a lot of feedback that has been entirely useful in that area.
Yeah. Well, I wish you luck, and I think you have a hard road ahead of you. I will help out where I can, and I hope that this sparks some more people to join in on this, because I mean, when I heard what Marc is doing, I was like, this is something that's needed by several different sources. And like you said, though, every organization in the government has claimed their hold on that they are the king. And going back to what we talked about, the mutually respectful manner has not existed anywhere I've been. It's been an authority and a group of minions is how it's been approached from every different department in the government, thinking the same thing and thinking the same thing of another group that's also in the department or within the government. So I would hope, and my thoughts are that this is actually, if we pull together a grouping of, we'll say the lower tier. I mean, how would I explain that? If we pull together a grouping of small players, might be better than to keep going down the path of the big players and the big groups in the government, because they all have, we'll say, a major ego involved with that. They're already doing everything, and they're the center of attention, and everybody kind of needs to orbit around their activities. And I think that is where all of them fail and fall short.
Absolutely. I think it's kind of like the folks did back in the 50s at the Rand Corp. They got together a group of people and they said, okay, specifically, how can we address this? How can we attack this? Where will the bombs fall? How many bombs will it take to retaliate if the bombs do start falling? And, we're looking more from a defensive perspective here. How can we prevent attacks on our cyber terrorist network? How can we enhance the defenses that we have in place? And I think they're doing that. They're getting together a group that is well qualified and knowledgeable in this field, that might be something that we might be able to enhance. So that's where I'm coming from, what I hope to do. And I really appreciate your help with this, sir.
Yes. Well, hey, thanks a lot, Mark, for joining today. And you have a good day, and enjoy the rest of your vacation there in sunny Florida. I'm enjoying some snow here as we talk here.
Thank you very much.
All right. You have a great day, Mark.
It's going to get worse before it gets better.
Yep, it will. You have a great day, though, Mark.
Thank you, sir.
Bye.
You as well.